The auctioneer's hammer was already raised when Hazel Winslow opened her mouth and said the number that changed everything. $140. The crowd at the Millhaven Livestock Fair went dead silent. Every sun-baked face turned toward her, this woman in a dusty brown dress with a fraying hem, standing straight-backed and unblinking at the edge of the bidding pen. She was not supposed to be here. Not like this. Not throwing down a number that made the auctioneer's eyebrows climb halfway up his forehead and made the man across the pen, the broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, iron-jawed man who had been running every other bidder out of the fair since sunup, go absolutely, dangerously still. Perry Watkins had not been outbid once today. Not once. He had walked through this fair like a force of nature, methodically claiming the best stock before anyone else could draw breath to counter. 3/4 horses, 2 breeding bulls, a pair of mules that the Haverson brothers had driven all the way from Abilene to purchase. Gone. All gone, every last animal absorbed into Perry Watkins' growing bid sheet, with a quiet, ruthless efficiency that had made older ranchers shake their heads and younger ones step back without a fight. And now this woman, this stranger, had just countered his $130 bid on the roan stallion that he had already mentally placed in his own corral. Hazel's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth, but her face showed nothing. She had practiced showing nothing for the better part of 4 years. It was the one skill she had mastered completely, and she wore it now like armor. $140 from the lady at the east fence, the auctioneer called out, his voice recovering from his shock and sliding back into its practiced rhythm. "Do I hear 150? Perry Watkins' jaw tightened. His dark eyes moved across the pen and found her, and for a long, scorching moment he simply looked at her, not with anger exactly, not with contempt, with something more complicated than either of those things. Like a man trying to calculate a variable he had not anticipated, he raised his hand. 150. Hazel did not flinch. 160. The crowd exhaled a collective sound, half gasp, half murmur, and shifted on its feet like a single living thing. This was the moment. This was the match that lit the fire. And to understand why Hazel Winslow was standing in a livestock fair in the summer heat of 1878, in the drought-cracked territory of southwestern Kansas, outbidding the most feared buyer in 3 counties on a horse she did not strictly need, you had to go back to where the real story began. To the morning she loaded the last of her father's debts into a wagon and drove toward Millhaven with nothing but a land deed, a plan, and 4 years of compressed grief looking for somewhere to go. Hazel Winslow had turned 26 years old the previous March. She had been running the Winslow homestead single-handedly for 4 years, since the winter her father, Gerald Winslow, had died of a chest fever that took him in less than 2 weeks. The kind of death that felt like a robbery, fast and incomprehensible, leaving behind a grief with no time to prepare for it. Gerald Winslow had been a careful man, a good man, but he had borrowed against his land during a bad season and had not quite paid it back before the fever took him. He had left Hazel a 300-acre spread just east of Millhaven, 2 elderly draft horses, a dairy cow, 8 chickens, a leaking roof, and a debt of $220 to a man named Chet Purvis, who was neither careful nor good. Chet Purvis ran the largest ranch in the county. He ran other things too, the grain storage, a piece of the mill, and an informal system of loans that he called neighborly assistance and everyone else called a trap. He was in his mid-50s, wide across the middle, perpetually cheerful in a way that made people's skin crawl, and he had made it known through casual comments dropped in the general store and at Sunday services that he had his eye on Hazel's 300 acres. They sat right alongside his eastern pasture and would neatly double his grazing land if he could get them. For 4 years, Hazel had refused to give him that satisfaction. She had planted a kitchen garden, expanded it, sold produce at the Millhaven market. She had taken in washing when times were lean. She had repaired the roof herself with lumber she bartered for using preserved goods. She had slowly, agonizingly paid down her father's debt to Chet Purvis, whittling it from $220 to $40, and she had done it without asking anyone for help and without letting Purvis see a single moment of desperation on her face. The roan stallion at the Millhaven Livestock Fair was not an indulgence. He was a calculation. Hazel's 2 elderly draft horses were failing. One, she privately suspected, would not survive another winter. The roan stallion was young, 4 years old, well-built, with sound legs and a temperament the handler called manageable, which in fair language meant not actively homicidal. With a good stallion, Hazel could breed her neighbor's mares, charge a service fee, and turn a consistent income that would let her finally put the last $40 on Purvis's desk and walk away free. She had come to the fair with $160. Every cent she had saved over the last 2 years, pulled from an old tobacco tin, she kept behind the loose stone in her fireplace. She had not told anyone she was coming. She had hitched her old mare to the wagon before dawn and driven the 12 miles to Millhaven with the tin on the seat beside her and a very specific plan in her head. What she had not planned for was Perry Watkins. She had noticed him early in the morning when she arrived at the fairground and began making her way through the pens, evaluating the stock. He was hard not to notice, not because he was loud, but because of the opposite. He moved through the crowd with a quiet certainty that parted people around him the way a prow parts water, and everywhere he stopped long enough to be sure. He ran his hands along legs, checked teeth, watched a horse walk before he bid. He was not showy about it. He was thorough. Hazel had found herself watching him the way you watched a professional practice their craft, with a kind of irritated respect, because you could see he was good at it, and that was inconvenient to admit. She had been watching when he bid on the roan, and she had seen the way his hand moved, just a slight lift of 2 fingers. Economical, like a man who had done this so many times that it required no theatrics. And she had seen the number on the chalkboard climb from 70 to 90 to 100 to 130, and she had watched every other bidder drop away. She had stood there for a long moment with the tobacco tin's weight still in her memory, and then something had moved in her that was not quite impulsiveness and not quite desperation, but somewhere between the two. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something and deciding to step forward anyway. Not because you were reckless, but because standing still had its own cost, and you had already paid too much of it. She had said $140. Now she stood in the late morning heat, with the auctioneer looking between them like a man refereeing a duel, and the crowd arranged around the pen in a loose semicircle of barely contained fascination. Perry Watkins looked at her one more time across the churned dirt of the bidding pen. His expression had shifted from calculation to something she could not quite read, not fury, not dismissal. If she had to name it, she would have said he looked like a man encountering a problem he found unexpectedly interesting. 170, he said. Hazel's stomach dropped. 170 was $10 more than she had. It was over. She had pushed and he had absorbed it, and now she was out of the game. But before the auctioneer could bring down his hammer, Hazel did something she had not done in 4 years. She asked for help, not loudly, not to the crowd. She turned to the woman standing beside her, a small, wiry woman of about 50 named Dot Callahan, who ran the feed store in Millhaven with her husband, and who had been cheerfully narrating the entire bidding war to the women around her like a sports announcer. "Dot," Hazel said quietly, "can you lend me $10? I will have it back to you by Friday." Dot Callahan looked at her for 2 full seconds. Then she dug into her apron pocket and pressed a folded bill into Hazel's hand without a word. Hazel turned back to the pen. 180, she said. The silence that followed was something you could have weighed. Perry Watkins went completely still. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Somewhere in the crowd, a man exhaled slowly through his nose. And then Perry Watkins did something that no one at the Millhaven Livestock Fair had seen him do all day. He did not raise his hand. The auctioneer waited the customary count 1, 2, 3, and brought the hammer down with a crack that sounded to Hazel like a door closing. Sold. $180 to the lady at the east fence. The crowd broke into sound. Some people laughed, some applauded more than Hazel would have expected. She heard a woman behind her say, "Well, I'll be," in a tone of pure delight. She heard a man say something she chose not to parse. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer's table and walked toward it on legs that were, she now discovered, made partly of rubber. She counted the money out with careful hands. She took the paperwork. She signed it with her name, Hazel Winslow, written in the clear, deliberate letters her father had taught her, because he had believed that a woman who could not write her name clearly was a woman who could be cheated, and she breathed. She had the horse. She was $10 in debt to Dot Callahan, and she would need to sell preserves for the next month to cover it, but she had the horse, and the plan was still intact, and she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of private triumph before someone stepped into her field of vision, and the world reorganized itself around the presence of Perry Watkins. He was taller up close than he had looked across the pen, not in an intimidating way, or rather, not only in an intimidating way. He had the kind of height and breadth that came from actual physical work, from fence posts and heavy lifting and long days on horseback, and he was probably 30, maybe 31, with dark brown hair that had been combed with reasonable ambition that morning and had since lost its argument with the Kansas wind. His eyes, at close range, were not black as she had thought. They were dark brown, almost amber in the direct sunlight, and they held an expression that was definitely not anger. He extended his hand. "Perry Watkins," he said, "that was very well done." Hazel looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She had been prepared for irritation, challenge, even hostility. She had not been prepared for this, for a simple, direct statement of respect delivered without any apparent ulterior motive, in a voice that was low and unhurried. She shook his hand. "Hazel Winslow, is the stallion for your ranch, Miss Winslow, or are you purchasing for a buyer?" "My ranch," she said. The Winslow spread east of town. Something moved in his expression. "Gerald Winslow's place." "My father's place," she said, with just enough emphasis on the possessive that he could hear it. "Mine now." He nodded once. "I knew your father slightly. He had good sense about land." He paused. "He also knew horses. I can see that ran in the family." Hazel regarded him for a moment. There was no performance in how he said it. He meant it plainly, and he offered it plainly, and this was not the behavior she had expected from the man who had steamrolled through this entire fair like a one-man acquisition company. "Why did you stop?" she asked, because she was someone who preferred directness to wondering. He met her eyes without any apparent discomfort. "Because 180 was a fair price for that horse, and it was clear you were going to keep going. There wasn't a winning move that didn't involve making myself look like a fool in front of 50 people. So it was strategy," she said. "It was also the right thing to do," he said, which surprised her into a brief silence. Around them the fair was resuming its noise, the auctioneer moving on to a pair of mules, the crowd redistributing itself. Hazel became aware that Dot Callahan was approximately 8 feet away, pretending to examine a fence post with entirely too much interest. "Are you staying in Millhaven tonight?" Perry asked. "No," she said. "I need to get the stallion home before dark." He nodded again, thoughtful. "I will be at the Millhaven Fair again in 3 weeks for the grain market. There is a matter about the land east of town I believe may be relevant to you." Hazel's eyes sharpened. "What matter?" "Not the right time for it," he said. "I don't want to say something incomplete and have it sit wrong." But he paused, choosing his words with care. "I would suggest you know where your deed is kept and that you have read all of it." The afternoon sunlight felt different after he said that. It felt like a warning wrapped in too little information, and Hazel's instincts, honed by 4 years of managing threats she could not always name, came fully alert. "That is a strange thing to say to someone you met 4 minutes ago," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I apologize, just—" He looked at her steadily. "Read the deed." He touched his hat brim and walked away. Hazel watched him go and then turned to find Dot Callahan at her elbow, eyes bright with undisguised excitement. "Perry Watkins," Dot said, as if tasting the name. "He has never once introduced himself to anyone at this fair. Not once in the 3 years he's been coming." Maybe he runs out of things to buy at some point, Hazel said, more to herself than to Dot, and tried to make her hands stop shaking as she went to collect her stallion. She named the roan Copperhead on the drive home, not for any sinister reason, but because his coat in the afternoon light had exactly that warm red-brown color of a copperhead after rain. He rode in the back of the wagon with a calm acceptance of circumstances that she found deeply reassuring after the chaos of the afternoon. She talked to him most of the way home, which was something she had always done with animals and never with people, or not with many people. When she got back to the homestead, she did what Perry Watkins had told her to do before she even unhitched the wagon. She went inside to the fireplace and moved the loose stone and pulled out the tobacco tin, which now held only the receipt for the stallion, and then went to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed where she kept her important papers. The deed was there in its folded oilskin casing, just as it had always been. She sat on the edge of the bed and read it in the failing light, every line of it, the way she had not done since the day after her father's funeral when she had been still too raw with grief to absorb most of what she read. She found it on the second page. A clause, written in the small, precise handwriting of a land office clerk, that said the following: "In the event that the deed holder shall fail to satisfy all outstanding liens against the property within 5 years of the death of the original deed holder, said property shall revert by right of first lien to the lien holder." Hazel read it twice, 3 times. Her father had died in the winter of 1874. 5 years from the winter of 1874 was the winter of 1879. She had until the end of this year, 1878, by any reasonable reading of that clause. She had until winter. She still owed Chet Purvis $40. She sat very still in the dimming bedroom, and for the first time in a long time she felt the particular cold of a trap closing around her. Not from ambush, not from surprise. From a document she had held in her hands and had not read carefully enough, and from a man she had underestimated the depth of his patience. Chet Purvis had known about this clause since her father died. He had been collecting his payments in small amounts, slow amounts, deliberately keeping the debt alive, keeping her in it, waiting for the clock to run out. She understood now why he had never pressed her harder, why he had never seemed angry when she brought him payments, why he had smiled his perpetually cheerful smile. He was not waiting to be paid. He was waiting for her to run out of time. The stallion in the corral was going to save her. She was certain of it. But he needed to earn money, and earning money took time, and time was the one thing that was now running out. She needed to know more. She needed to know if her reading of the deed was correct, and she needed to know how Perry Watkins knew about it. And she needed to find a way to either close that debt before winter or challenge the clause itself. And for any of those things she needed information she did not currently have. She was back in Millhaven the following morning. The town of Millhaven in 1878 was not a large place. It had a main street of about 8 buildings, a church at one end and the grain mill at the other, with the general store, the post office, a small hotel that also served as the town's only saloon in the evenings, and Dot Callahan's feed store running along both sides. There was one lawyer named Martin Graves, who had practiced out of a back room behind the general store for 15 years and who had a reputation for being slow but honest. Hazel went to Martin Graves first. She laid the deed on his desk and pointed to the clause and watched his face. He read it slowly, which was his way with everything, and then he read it again, and then he set his glasses on the desk and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Your reading is correct," he said. "If there is any outstanding lien against this property when the 5-year window closes, the lien holder has a legal claim to it. Can the clause be challenged? On what grounds?" "On the grounds that the lien holder has been deliberately withholding full collection in order to keep the debt alive past the deadline," she said. Graves looked at her with something approaching surprise. "That is a sophisticated argument. Is it a valid one?" He was quiet for a long moment. "It might be." If you could prove deliberate manipulation of the payment schedule, that Purvis refused to accept larger payments, or that he engineered the amount collected to ensure the debt persisted, then a judge might agree that he was acting in bad faith and refuse to enforce the reversion clause. He paused. But proving that would require documentation. Did he ever refuse a larger payment? Hazel thought back, her memory scanning the last 4 years of transactions. She had always brought exactly what she could manage, and Purvis had always accepted it with that same smooth smile. She had never offered more. She had never been in a position to offer more until very recently. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've never tried to pay more than I had." Graves nodded slowly. "Then you need to try, today if possible. Go to Purvis with as much as you can give him and ask to pay the full remaining balance. If he refuses, or if he invents reasons to delay acceptance, document everything. Bring a witness if you can." Hazel had $17 in her apron pocket. She had intended to use it for supplies, and for the 10 she owed Callahan. She paid Callahan first, because that debt was clean, and the woman had given it without hesitation. Then she went to the general store and asked for paper and a pen, and she wrote out a careful letter to Chet Purvis stating that she wished to pay the remaining balance of her lien in full and asking when she might call at his ranch to do so. She sealed it and gave it to the postmaster, and then stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the post office in the heat of the morning and tried to think. "Miss Winslow." She turned. Perry Watkins was crossing the street toward her from the direction of the feed store. He was not expected. She had thought she had 3 weeks until the grain market, and the unexpectedness of him made her say, more sharply than she intended, "Are you following me?" He stopped walking. "I had a grain delivery to see about this morning. I wasn't aware you would be in town." He paused. "Did you read the deed?" "I read it," she said. "What do you know about the clause?" He looked at her steadily and seemed to make a decision. "Can we talk somewhere that isn't the middle of the street?" They went to the small courtyard behind the post office, which had a bench and a tree that provided enough shade to make conversation feel less like standing in the middle of a stage. Hazel sat on the bench. Perry remained standing, hat in his hands, which she found oddly respectful given that he hadn't needed to remove it at all. "Tell me what you know," she said. "All of it," he told her. He laid it out in the same careful, methodical way he had run his hands along a horse's legs the day before, thoroughly, without drama, beginning at the beginning. He had come to the Millhaven area 2 years ago to purchase the Danver property, a 200-acre ranch that sat on the western side of Purvis's holdings. He had dealt with Purvis briefly in that transaction. Purvis had wanted the Danver land too, and had made his position clear. And in the course of those dealings he had learned, through a conversation he had not been intended to overhear, that Purvis had a broader land acquisition strategy running. The Winslow spread was one of at least 4 properties Purvis was hoping to absorb through lapsed lien agreements. "He keeps the debts alive," Perry said. "He never presses, never threatens, just collects slowly and waits for the clock. He's done it twice before that I know of. The Hendersons, 2 years before you, and a family called Marsh before that. Both times the property reverted when the lien outlasted the 5-year window." Hazel felt the cold settle deeper in her chest. "He's done this before and no one has stopped him." "No one knew what to call it or how to prove it," Perry said. "It looks like patience. It looks like a man not demanding his money, which seems kind. It's only predatory if you know to look for the end game." "And now you've told me," she said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then, because I knew your father, as I said. He was a decent man. And because," he paused again, and she had the sense that he was choosing his words not to manage her, but because he genuinely meant to be precise. "I don't like watching someone walk into something they can't see when I can see it clearly enough to say something." Hazel looked at him for a long time. There was no hidden performance in his face that she could detect, and she was good at detecting those things. 4 years of managing Chet Purvis and his cheerful oblique threats had made her very sensitive to the gap between what people said and what they meant. "I sent Purvis a letter this morning asking to pay the full balance," she said. Perry nodded. "That's the right move." "He may not respond well. What does he do when someone tries to close the debt?" Perry's expression shifted in a way that was not quite concern but was adjacent to it. "When the Marsh family tried to pay their lien in full about 6 months before the window closed, Purvis claimed they had miscalculated the interest and that they owed more than they had been told. By the time the dispute was sorted, the window had closed." Hazel absorbed this. "So he invents reasons to keep the debt alive until it's too late." "That would be my expectation. Then I need witnesses," she said, "and I need a lawyer who can move fast when he invents a reason." "Martin Graves is honest," Perry said. "But he's not fast." "No," she agreed. "He's not." She looked at the tree above her. A meadowlark was making an enormous amount of noise in its branches, absolutely indifferent to the human problems below it. "Do you know the land office in Dodge City?" "I do." "Can the clause be challenged at the territorial level rather than the county level? If Purvis has county judges in his pocket, he might have," Perry said, "though I don't know that for certain." "I don't either," she said. "But I'm not going to assume he doesn't." She stood up from the bench. "I need to know how long I have exactly and what documentation I need to build a case. And I need someone who can move faster than Martin Graves." Perry was looking at her with that same expression from the day before, the one she hadn't quite been able to name. Up close it was slightly easier to read. It was the expression of a man who had expected a problem and found something more interesting. "I know a lawyer in Dodge City," he said. "A woman named Catherine Blake. She practices there and she's handled land disputes before." "A woman lawyer," Hazel said, with the particular inflection of someone who found that both surprising and immediately relevant to their worldview. "She passed the bar in '74, Perry said. "She's sharp and she doesn't like Chet Purvis, which may or may not be relevant to your situation." Hazel looked at him. Something was shifting in her assessment of this man. This man who had shown up at a livestock fair and driven prices high, and moved through the world with a quiet authority that should have made him exactly the kind of person she had no use for, and who had instead turned out to have information she needed, and a lawyer's name in his pocket, and an apparent willingness to simply help without visible strings attached. She did not trust easily. 4 years of fighting alone had calcified some of that distrust into habit. But she was also someone who could read a situation, and the situation here was that she was running out of time and this man had resources she did not have. "Would you write me an introduction?" she asked. "I'll take you there if you'll let me," he said. "I have business in Dodge City next week in any case. You could come in the wagon and have a meeting with Blake and be back in 4 days." He seemed to read something in her expression because he added, "There is no obligation attached to that offer. It is a practical arrangement for a time-sensitive problem." Hazel studied him. "Why do you care, Mr. Watkins? You don't know me." "I knew your father," he said. "And I've watched Purvis do this twice before without being in a position to say anything useful. This time I was standing at the right place at the right livestock fair at the right moment, and I am in a position." He shrugged, and it was an entirely unaffected gesture, nothing theatrical about it. "That seems like reason enough." She considered that for a long moment. The meadowlark in the tree behind her was still singing, unconcerned with the gravity of human decisions. "All right," she said. "Next week. I'll need to arrange care for the animals." He nodded. "I'll call at your ranch on Tuesday morning if that suits." "It suits," she said. "And Mr. Watkins," she paused until he met her eyes, "if this turns out to have some hidden motive I can't currently see, I want you to know in advance that I will be considerably more unpleasant than I was at the livestock fair." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one there and gone. "I'd expect nothing less," he said. She drove home with the plan taking shape in her head, and tried very hard not to think about the way his voice sounded, which was low and unhurried, and somehow made the words in it feel like they had weight. Chet Purvis sent a reply to her letter 2 days later. She was in the garden when the Millhaven postmaster's boy delivered it on horseback, and she opened it standing in the dirt with her hands still earthy and read it in the afternoon light. It was brief. It said that he was pleased she was in a position to consider settling her account, and that he would be happy to receive her at his ranch on any convenient day, and that of course she should understand that, in reviewing the original loan documentation, he had determined that the agreed interest rate had been somewhat different from what had been discussed, and that the remaining balance was in fact not $40 but $73. Hazel read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully, the way you handled something you intended to use later as evidence, and went inside to wash her hands and write down in her journal, with exact date and time and full detail, what the letter said and when it had arrived. She was ready for him. She had half expected this. It did not make her less angry, but anger was not the emotion she was feeding right now. The emotion she was feeding was the clear-eyed, forward-moving purpose of someone who has identified a problem and is going to solve it. She added the letter to the tobacco tin with the deed. She wrote her own summary of the legal situation in the front of the journal. Then she went out and spent an hour with Copperhead in the corral, running him through his paces in the fading light, because the horse still had work to do and the plan was still intact underneath the complication. He was a magnificent animal. Even in her current state of mind she could appreciate it, the way he moved, strong and smooth, the copper coat gleaming in the evening light. He was worth every dollar of what she had paid and the trouble of getting him. She thought about Perry Watkins saying it was well done, and then she tried to stop thinking about it and found that she couldn't entirely. Tuesday arrived clear and warm. Perry showed up at her ranch at 8 in the morning driving a well-maintained wagon with 2 solid horses, and he helped her load the small bag she had packed with the same matter-of-fact ease with which he had done everything else, and they set out on the road to Dodge City before 8:30 without any particular ceremony. Hazel had arranged for her neighbor, Mrs. Fetter, an elderly widow who lived half a mile down the road and who kept her own chickens and was deeply fond of animals, to look in on the horses and the cow twice a day in exchange for 2 jars of Hazel's preserved peaches, which Mrs. Fetter considered the finest thing produced in the county and would have agreed to nearly any terms to obtain. The road to Dodge City was about 45 miles, which in 1878 on a Kansas road in summer meant 2 solid days of travel with an overnight stop in the small town of Graybill, where Perry had evidently arranged rooms in advance at the boarding house, which Hazel only discovered when they pulled up and the landlady knew his name. "You planned this before I agreed," she said, not quite accusing. "I planned for the possibility," he said. "I would have canceled if you'd said no. And if the boarding house had had no room when I said yes. I'd have slept in the wagon," he said, completely straightforwardly. He looked at her. "There was no trap in it, Miss Winslow. I do understand why you're checking." Hazel decided that was the honest answer and let it be. She had a clean room with a real bed, and the landlady brought hot water for washing, which after 2 days on a dusty road was the closest thing to heaven Hazel had experienced in some time. They ate dinner in the boarding house common room. It was a simple meal: beef stew, cornbread, coffee, and they ate it largely in a silence that was, Hazel found, not uncomfortable. He ate without fuss, without pretension, and when she asked him a question he answered it, and when she didn't he didn't manufacture conversation to fill the space. She asked him about his ranch. He had 350 acres on the western side of Millhaven, which he had built up over the past 2 years from the original Danver property. He ran mostly cattle with some horse breeding, had 2 full-time ranch hands, and was in the middle of a slow, deliberate expansion that he described with the same methodical clarity he seemed to apply to everything. "Is that why you're such a fierce buyer at the fair?" she asked. "You're building stock deliberately." "I don't waste money," he said. "But I also don't lose animals to poor quality." He paused. "The roan stallion was genuinely excellent. You made a good choice." "I know," she said, but she found herself smiling as she said it, which was unexpected enough that she quickly put the coffee cup in front of her face. She thought he might have seen it. He looked at the table in a way that suggested he might be hiding an expression of his own. She asked him about his history. He told her without apparent reluctance. He had grown up in Missouri, the second son of a small farm family, had come west at 22 in 1870 after his older brother inherited the family land. He had spent 3 years working as a hired hand on various ranches across Kansas and Indian Territory before he had enough saved to buy a stake of his own. He mentioned, without drama, that those 3 years had been hard in ways he would not enumerate, and Hazel understood from the way he said it that the hardness was real and the lack of enumeration was not evasion but privacy, which she respected because she extended the same right to herself. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked. Not about those years specifically, more as a general question, testing. He looked at her directly. "Nothing relevant to your situation or to anything between us. The parts I don't volunteer are personal and mine. They're not secrets that would change your assessment of whether to trust me." Hazel considered that answer for a long time. Then she nodded once. "All right," she said. "That's a fair distinction." Dodge City in the late summer of 1878 was in its full, complicated life. It was a cattle town and a railroad town, and a place where the civilizing forces of churches and civic organizations and women's reading groups existed in constant, unresolved tension, with the rougher energies of saloons and gambling halls, and the general lawlessness that the cattle trade brought with the drovers. It smelled of cattle and dust and industry, and it moved at a speed that felt different from Millhaven's quieter rhythms. Catherine Blake's office was on a side street off the main avenue, a clean, sensibly organized space with bookshelves that covered every wall and a desk that was buried under papers. She clearly knew the location of despite appearances. Catherine Blake herself was 35, compact, dark-haired, with a quality of focused attention that Hazel immediately recognized as belonging to someone who made good use of their intelligence every day. She shook Hazel's hand first, and then Perry's, and then she sat behind her desk and said, "Tell me everything." Hazel told her everything. She had brought the tobacco tin with all her documents, and she laid them on the desk one by one: the deed, the letter from Purvis altering the debt amount, the journal entries, her own accounting records from 4 years of payments. Catherine Blake read through all of it without interruption, making small notes on a separate piece of paper, her expression entirely professional and entirely focused. When Hazel finished, Catherine looked up. "This is a strong case," she said. Hazel felt something loosen in her chest that had been very tightly wound. "Explain that to me," she said. "I don't want to assume." "The alteration of the debt amount is the most valuable piece," Catherine said. "You have 4 years of payment records that align with the original figure. He has now provided a written statement claiming a different figure without, I would wager, any documentation to support the change. That is fraud, plainly written. Additionally, the pattern you've described, the deliberate slow collection across multiple properties, can be evidenced through the Henderson and Marsh cases if they kept records and are willing to speak. Would a territorial judge hear it?" "I will file in Dodge City," Catherine said, "not in Millhaven. We will also file an injunction to prevent any property reversion while the case is active. That gives us time." She looked at Hazel steadily. "I want to be honest with you about risk. If Purvis has money behind him and we're in front of a judge who favors him, we may lose anyway. Law is not always just." "I know," Hazel said, "but I'd rather fight than hand it over." Catherine Blake smiled. It was a swift, sharp, admiring smile. "Then let's fight." They spent the rest of the morning in Catherine's office going through every document. Perry sat in the corner through most of it, largely silent but present in a way that Hazel found, to her mild alarm, grounding. When Catherine asked his opinion on the land geography and adjacent property lines, which were legally relevant to the case, he answered with precision and without editorializing. They had lunch at a restaurant on the main avenue, the three of them, which was a slightly strange meal because Hazel kept noticing things about Perry in a public setting that she hadn't quite registered before. The way he held the door. The way he spoke to the restaurant owner with the same plain respect he used with everyone regardless of their position. The way he ate his lunch without any ostentation and then paid the bill before Hazel could open her purse, not with a theatrical gesture but simply by handing the money over while she was still looking at her bag's clasp. "I didn't ask you to pay for my lunch," she said. "I know," he said. "You didn't ask me to arrange the rooms in Grable either. I think of it as," he seemed to search for the word, "hospitality, not obligation. You don't owe me anything for it." Hazel looked at him across the restaurant table. Outside the window, Dodge City moved through its loud, complicated afternoon. Inside, in this specific small moment, something was happening that she did not have adequate vocabulary for yet because she had not allowed herself to develop vocabulary for it in some years. She thought about what Dot Callahan had said. He has never once introduced himself to anyone at this fair, not once. She picked up her coffee cup and drank from it and looked out the window and said, very deliberately, "What made you stop bidding?" He looked at her. "I told you. It was a fair price and I didn't want to look like a fool." "That's one reason," she said. "What's the other one?" A longer pause. Outside, a wagon went by at some speed and someone shouted at the driver. Perry watched her with an expression she was beginning to understand was his careful honesty face, the one he wore when he was deciding how precisely to be true. "I was curious about you," he said, and curiosity seemed worth more than the horse. Hazel felt the warmth of it before she could stop herself. She looked at the table. Then she looked back up because she had decided some years ago not to be a person who looked away from things. "That's a very strange compliment," she said. "I'm a fairly straightforward person," he said. "I don't usually improve on first attempts." She laughed. It came out before she meant it to a genuine laugh, the kind she had not produced in a very specific way in a very long time, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. She pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth, half astonished at herself. Perry Watkins smiled at her, not the ghost of one this time. The real thing, and it changed his face in a way that she filed away without meaning to, in the part of her mind where things got stored without any formal instruction. They left Dodge City the next morning after a second meeting with Catherine Blake, who had already begun drafting the injunction. She gave Hazel a copy of everything and told her she would file within the week and send notice to Hazel when it was done. She also told her to avoid meeting with Purvis alone and to ensure that any communication went through Graves in Millhaven so there was a legal witness to every exchange. The road back was easier than the road there, which is often how roads go. The problem was not smaller, in fact, in the full legal shape Catherine had laid out. It was more complex than Hazel had initially understood. But the shape of it was visible now, and visible problems were ones she could address. It was the invisible ones that had been eating at her for 4 years. She and Perry talked more on the return trip. Not about the case mostly. He asked about her garden. She had mentioned it in passing, and she found herself describing it in more detail than she had intended. The rows of vegetables she had carefully cultivated, the herbs she grew in a window box she had made from scrap lumber. He asked what she grew and why, and the question had genuine interest in it, so she answered genuinely. She asked him about his horses. He described the breeding program he was developing with the same careful enthusiasm. It was not dramatic excitement, but the specific engaged pleasure of someone who has found work they are genuinely suited to. He described a mare he was most proud of with a warmth in his voice that made something in her chest do an inconvenient thing. At one point, the road dipped through a shallow creek crossing, and the wagon lurched as the wheel found an unexpected depth. Hazel grabbed the side with one hand and Perry's forearm with the other, a pure reflex, and then they were through the dip, and the wagon was level again, and she realized she had hold of his arm and released it quickly. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. She kept her eyes on the road and was reasonably sure her face was doing things she would prefer it not to do. They stopped for the night in Grable again. This time over dinner, there was a quality to the silence between them that was different from the first night, warmer, somehow. The way a room feels different once you have spent time in it. She told him about her father, not the grief parts, but the living parts, the parts where Hazel Winslow had taught her to read a horse's legs, had let her sit with him when he made decisions about the land, had told her repeatedly that the best thing he could do for her was make sure she could take care of herself. "He sounds like a man who understood things clearly," Perry said. "He did," she said. "He just didn't understand Chet Purvis clearly enough." Or maybe he didn't think, she paused, maybe he didn't think Purvis would use the claws. They weren't enemies. "No one thinks the trap is for them until it closes," Perry said quietly. Hazel looked at him. "That sounds like something you know from experience." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My first year out here after I left Missouri, I worked for a man who offered me a partnership in exchange for a year's labor. At the end of the year, he produced a contract I had signed that said partnership meant I would receive a percentage of future profits, not current ownership. I had nothing." He met her eyes. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because I know what it is to have the ground move under your feet when you thought you knew where it was." Hazel held his gaze. "What did you do?" "I walked away with what I had, which was the knowledge of how that kind of contract is written." He paused. "And I read everything carefully after that." She understood then why he had told her to read the deed. It was not a mysterious warning. It was the specific, practical advice of someone who had learned its necessity in the most direct possible way. "Thank you," she said, "for saying that." He shrugged slightly. "Truth isn't much of a gift, it's just what is." "Sometimes it's the most valuable thing anyone can give," she said. They looked at each other across the boarding house table with the candle between them burning down in the warm August night. And Hazel was very much aware of the fact that something was in the process of happening, something she had not expected to happen at a livestock fair in the middle of a very specific financial and legal crisis, something she was not certain she knew how to handle, but which she found herself entirely unwilling to run from. They arrived back in Millhaven the following afternoon. He helped her unload her bag at her ranch, checked that the horses were well Mrs. Fetter had done an excellent job, and Copperhead in the corral tossed his head when Hazel appeared in a way that she found extremely gratifying. And then Perry stood by his wagon with the reins loose in his hands and seemed to be looking for the right way to say something. "I'd like to call on you," he said, "if you'd allow it." Hazel looked at him in the late afternoon light. The homestead was behind her, the house she had saved and fought for, the land she intended to keep, the life she had built out of grief and stubbornness, and a very determined refusal to be defeated. And in front of her was this man who had stopped bidding at $180 and introduced himself and taken her to Dodge City and told her about his own trap so she would understand what she was fighting. "You can call on me," she said. "I'm usually in the garden by 6 if you come in the morning." He smiled. "6 it is," he said, and climbed onto the wagon and drove away, and Hazel watched him go and then turned to the corral and put her forehead briefly against Copperhead's warm neck and breathed. He called on her the following Saturday. Not at 6. She suspected the 6 was an invitation to be taken literally if he wanted to, not a demand, but at 10, which was also a respectable time. He brought 2 things, a jar of wild honey from a neighbor who kept bees, and news that the Henderson family, who had lost their land to Purvis through the same lien mechanism 2 years earlier, had agreed to speak to Catherine Blake. The honey was sitting on Hazel's kitchen table, and she was reading his letter about the Hendersons at the same time, which meant she kept looking back and forth between the 2 things with an expression she was glad no one was witnessing. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. Each time there was a practical reason news from Dodge City about the case, a question about a fence line that was relevant to the legal filings, a book he had thought she might want to read, which turned out to be a collection of essays about Western land law that was admittedly one of the most useful things anyone had ever given her, and also suggested he had been paying close attention to what she actually needed rather than what people usually offered. The days between his visits began to have a specific quality, not emptiness, because Hazel was not someone whose days were empty, but a particular forward pull, the way certain days have when you know something is coming. Catherine Blake filed the injunction. The Dodge City Court accepted it, which meant that no property reversion could take place while the case was active. Purvis, through his own lawyer in Millhaven, contested it and was told that the contest would need to go through the territorial court. There was, it appeared, documentation emerging in the Marsh family's case that was very relevant. Hazel heard about this on a Tuesday morning when Perry rode up to the homestead with the letter from Catherine Blake, and she read it standing in the yard, and then sat down on the porch step because her legs had decided they needed a moment. He sat beside her on the step, not close enough to crowd her. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the morning air, which was already warm on its own but somehow distinguishable. "It's working," she said. "It's working," he agreed. They sat there for a moment in the morning quiet. A finch was somewhere in the cottonwood tree near the fence, singing in complete ignorance of property law and litigation. Hazel looked at the land in front of her, the garden, the corral, the pasture beyond it, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the possibility of the future as something that might be good. "Perry," she said. "Yes. Why did you really stop bidding?" He turned to look at her. They were sitting close enough that she could see the detail of his eyes in the morning light, that warm amber brown, direct and unhidden. "I already told you," he said. "You told me the practical reason," she said, "and you told me you were curious. I want the real reason." He was quiet for a long time. The finch continued its editorial in the cottonwood. "I had been watching you all morning," he said finally, "from before the bidding started. You were alone and you were reading every animal like you knew what you were doing, and you didn't talk to anyone, and you had," he paused, "choosing a quality, like someone who had decided something and was going to do it." He looked at her steadily. "And then you bid against me, and I thought that is someone I would like to know." Hazel looked at the cottonwood tree. She looked at the corral where Copperhead was standing in the morning sun. She looked at her hands on her knees. "That," she said, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 4 years." He reached over and put his hand very gently over hers, not grasping, just resting there, warm and deliberate. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that on the porch step for a long time, with the finch singing and the morning moving around them. And Hazel thought that this specific ordinary morning, sitting on a porch step with a man who had seen her clearly from across a livestock pen and had decided not to outbid her, was something she would remember for the rest of her life. The case moved faster than either of them had dared hope. By October, Catherine Blake had assembled testimony from both the Henderson family and, through legal discovery, the Marsh family's surviving records. The territorial court in Dodge City scheduled a hearing for the first week of November. Purvis's lawyer, facing the documented evidence of 2 prior cases with the same pattern, attempted to settle. He sent an offer through Graves. The offer was that Purvis would forgive the remaining balance of the debt, now apparently back to the original $40 in their communications, and release the lien entirely if Hazel would agree to sell him a 50-acre strip along his eastern fence at a below-market price. Hazel read the offer and then wrote back a single sentence: "No." Graves delivered it with what she suspected was private satisfaction. The hearing was held in Dodge City on the 4th of November, 1878. Hazel drove there herself in her own wagon, with Perry riding alongside on horseback. Catherine Blake met them at the courthouse steps, brisk and prepared, with a leather portfolio full of evidence and 2 witnesses from the Henderson family who had traveled from their current home in Wichita to speak. The judge was a federal judge named Harmon, who had the aspect of a man who had heard every kind of case there was and had limited tolerance for any of them. He listened to Catherine's presentation with an expressionless face that Hazel found terrifying until the moment he turned to Purvis's lawyer and said, in a voice of complete judicial flatness, "Counsel, your client appears to have engaged in a systematic pattern of predatory lien management that this court finds troubling regardless of its technical legality." Purvis's lawyer argued for 2 hours. Catherine responded for 1. Judge Harmon recessed for 30 minutes and came back with a written ruling that he read from the bench. The lien was declared satisfied. The fraudulent alteration of the debt amount was declared actionable. The reversion clause was struck as unenforceable given documented evidence of bad faith. Chet Purvis owed Hazel Winslow a finding of damages for the interest she had paid above the actual original debt amount, which came to $31. Hazel sat in the courtroom chair and looked at the judge's bench and heard the words and felt each one land in her chest like something being unlocked. The land was hers. Not conditionally, not precariously, not subject to a clock she hadn't known was running. Hers. She went outside the courthouse and stood on the steps in the November air, which was cold and bright and completely indifferent to what had just happened inside the building, and she breathed. And then, without entirely planning to, she turned and put her face against Perry Watkins' chest and held on. He wrapped both arms around her. He did not say anything, which was exactly right, because there was nothing to say that was better than the quiet and the cold air, and the fact of having won the thing you were fighting for. When she stepped back, her eyes were wet, which she made no effort to conceal because she had decided a long time ago that concealing tears was not the same as being strong. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. His hands were still at her arms, warm through her coat, and his eyes were doing something she had learned to recognize over the last months, that look that was not quite a smile but held the warmth of one in its depths. "I need to thank you properly," she said. "You don't owe me, not because I owe you," she said. "Because I want to." She looked at him steadily. "Come to dinner on Sunday. I'll cook a real dinner, not boarding house stew." He smiled. "All right." Sunday dinner was roast chicken with the rosemary she had grown in the kitchen window, and potatoes from the garden and biscuits, and 2 preserved peaches for dessert. She had used the kitchen table and the 2 good chairs she owned, and the tablecloth her mother had made, which she had not used in years because it had felt like too much ceremony for one person eating alone. Perry arrived at exactly 5 o'clock with a bottle of wine from the general store and the appearance of a man who had made considerable effort with his hair and was not entirely sure it had been successful. She found this quietly charming. They ate the dinner at the kitchen table and talked for 3 hours, and the candles burned down around them, and the cold November night pressed against the windows and was kept out by the warmth of the fire and the warmth of the conversation. And when he finally stood to leave, he stayed in the doorway for a long moment, and she stood there with him, and neither of them moved for several seconds. "Hazel," he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her. Carefully, asking rather than demanding, with a warmth that was exactly what she had expected from him, and also somehow completely surprising. She kissed him back, and it was as if something that had been held very carefully at a distance came forward all at once. He pulled back and looked at her in the candlelight from inside the door, and his expression was the most fully open thing she had ever seen on his face. "I have been wanting to do that since the livestock fair," he said. "I know," she said. He laughed softly. "You know." "I was paying attention," she said. He kissed her once more, briefly, and then he left, and she stood in the doorway watching his lantern move down the dark road until she could not see it anymore. And then she went inside and washed the dishes and went to bed, and was not able to sleep for quite some time. They courted through the winter with the straightforwardness that characterized everything about Perry Watkins. He came to the homestead twice a week. She sometimes went to his ranch, which she found a deeply satisfying place, well organized, thoughtfully built, with a care in its maintenance that matched what she had observed about him in everything else. They rode together, which was something she had not done for pleasure in years, and discovered that they rode at the same pace and in the same comfortable quiet, and that this was one of those small compatibilities that mean more than they appear to. He told her more about Missouri, in pieces, over the course of those winter months. His mother, who had been a teacher and had given all her children the particular gift of someone who believed in the value of knowing things accurately. His older brother, with whom his relationship was complicated by the inheritance and the distance it had created, but not broken. He told her about the 3 hard years working as a hired hand, not everything, but enough that she understood what they had cost him, and why he moved through the world with the particular care of someone who has learned that the ground can shift. She told him things too, not just the facts of the last 4 years. She had told him most of those already, but the interior of them. The specific grief of the first winter after her father died, when she had gotten up every morning and done what needed to be done and felt, underneath all of it, a silence where the presence of another person had been. The feeling of being a woman alone on a land claim in a county that did not quite know what to do with that fact. The private triumph of every payment she had made, every jar she had sold, every repair she had made with her own hands. He listened to all of it with the full attention of someone who finds what they are being told genuinely worth their time. In January, when a cold snap brought ice to the water troughs and the days were short and silver gray, he arrived one morning not at the garden gate but at the front door, which was different enough from his usual routine that Hazel opened it with a slightly raised eyebrow. He was holding his hat in his hands, which was the posture she associated with him saying something important, and he looked at her with that careful honesty expression and said, "I would like to marry you, Hazel, if that is something you would consider." She had known this was coming. She was not someone who missed patterns, and she had thought about it, which meant she had truly thought about it, sitting with the idea in the morning quiet and the evening quiet and all the middle places between, and being very honest with herself about what it meant and what she wanted. What she wanted was this man, not in any reckless or abstract way. In the specific, concrete, well-observed way of someone who has watched a person over months and found that the more she knew about him, the more her certainty grew rather than diminished. What she also wanted and had not surrendered was the homestead, the land that was hers, the life she had fought for. "I have conditions," she said. He nodded. He had probably expected this. "Tell me." "The Winslow land stays in my name," she said. "We can combine operations however makes sense, but the deed stays in my name." "Of course," he said without any pause, as if it were the obvious answer which she supposed it was. "And I keep my own accounting," she said. "I'll share it with you, but I keep it." "That's sensible," he said, "and Copperhead is mine." Something lifted at the corner of his mouth. "Hazel, I lost a bid to you on that horse. I have a great deal of respect for the horse." She looked at him for a long moment in the gray January morning light. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He smiled fully then, and she stepped back from the door and let him in, and they sat at the kitchen table, and he produced, from his coat pocket, a ring that had been his mother's plain silver with a small garnet set flush in it. And he put it on her hand with the particular gentleness of someone who understood exactly what they were holding. They were married in April, when the Kansas spring was doing its brief and brilliant thing with the prairie grass, and the wildflowers coming up between the dry stalks of the previous year. The ceremony was at the Millhaven church, small and practical, with Dot Callahan weeping with cheerful enthusiasm in the front pew and Martin Graves looking unexpectedly moved, and Mrs. Fetter in her best dress, and Perry's 2 ranch hands cleaned up past recognition. Catherine Blake rode from Dodge City for the occasion. She shook Hazel's hand at the reception, held after the ceremony in the church yard, and said, "I'm glad you came to see me." Hazel said, "I'm glad Perry knew your name." They set up the combined household at the Winslow homestead, which had more livable space than Perry's ranch house, and which Hazel was, quite reasonably, not prepared to leave. Perry moved in with his practical, wordless efficiency, and within a month it felt as though the house had always been arranged this way. His books alongside hers on the shelf he built along the parlor wall, his coat by the door next to hers, his voice in the rooms in the morning. He expanded the corral. She expanded the garden. Copperhead served 3 mares that first spring, and the arrangement was exactly as profitable as Hazel had calculated. And she put the money into a jar that was not behind the fireplace stone. That particular stone and its associations could stay in the past, but in a proper tin box she kept in the desk drawer. The settlement with Purvis had left him legally exposed in ways that made Millhaven County re-examine his dealings more broadly. By the following year, 2 other families who had been entangled in his lien arrangements had been able to challenge their situations successfully, using Catherine Blake's work in Hazel's case as a precedent. Purvis remained in the county. He was not a man who was easily dislodged, but his power had narrowed considerably, and he passed Hazel on the street with a smile that no longer reached his eyes and an awareness that she met with a steady, pleasant look that said very clearly that she had nothing to be afraid of from him, and he should know it. She told Perry once, lying in bed on a winter evening with the fire going in the next room and the cold outside and his warmth beside her, that she felt guilty for not having fought harder sooner. For the 4 years she had paid into the trap without understanding it, for not reading the deed more carefully, for any path through those years that might have been different. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You saved the land, you paid the debt down, you raised Copperhead, you built something real with what you had. The fight, when you could see it clearly, you won." "We won," she said. "You started it alone," he said. "I was just fortunate to show up at the livestock fair." She turned to look at him in the firelight from the open bedroom door. "You stopped bidding on purpose," she said, "didn't you?" He held her gaze for one beat, two. "I stopped bidding at a fair price," he said. She studied him. "Perry." A pause. Then something genuine and slightly sheepish crossed his face, which she had very rarely seen. "The horse was worth $170, maybe $180. You needed him more than I did, and you were going to fight for him." He paused again. "I thought if I let you win, you might tell me your name." Hazel stared at him. Then she started laughing, the full, unguarded kind, the kind she had only ever managed since knowing him, and she pressed her face to his shoulder and laughed until she ran out of it. "You are the most straightforward, complicated person I have ever met," she said. "I'm not actually complicated," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "You engineered the outcome of a livestock bid," she said. "I declined to keep bidding past a reasonable point," he said. "Perry." "Hazel." She looked up at him, and he was looking at her with everything in his face visible and nothing hidden, and she thought, "This is what safe feels like," and was astonished that it had taken this specific form, this man, this homestead, this ordinary winter night to teach her. Their first child was born in the spring of 1880. A boy, which delighted Perry in a way that he would not have admitted was related to any preference, but was clearly producing a quiet glow. They named him Gerald, for Hazel's father, and he arrived in April on a morning that was cold and then warm in quick succession, the way Kansas April always was, and Hazel held him and looked out the bedroom window at the land in the new morning light, and felt her father somewhere in the quality of that light, in the name she had just given this small person. Perry sat beside her on the bed with his hand on her back, and looked at the baby with an expression she had no adequate language for and did not try to name. "He has your nose," Perry said. "He has your stubbornness," Hazel said, because the boy had arrived after 14 hours of having very strong opinions about the timing and the positioning, and had only been reasoned into existence with great collective effort. Perry laughed softly. 14 hours old, and you're already blaming me for his character." "It's the earliest I can accurately observe it," she said. Mrs. Calloway, who had been the midwife, finished her work and left them to themselves in the morning quiet, and they sat there with Gerald sleeping between them, and Hazel thought that this, the sum of all the choices that had brought her here, was what a life made of principle looked like from the inside. Not easy, not without cost, but hers, fully and verifiably hers, and shared now with someone who had never tried to take any part of it from her. The following years moved with the rhythm of real life, not always dramatic, not without difficulty, containing the ordinary and the extraordinary in the proportions that life tends to provide. They worked the land. They built the breeding program around Copperhead until the Watkins-Winslow Ranch. As it was known in Millhaven, both names retained in the hyphenation that reflected exactly what the operation was, had a reputation for quality horses that brought buyers from 3 counties. The garden produced, the cows produced, the chickens, replaced several times over in generational progression, produced. Perry's ranch on the western side was folded into the operation slowly, with a practical sensibility, its land leased to a young farming family named the Ortegas who had come up from the south and who managed the acreage carefully, and with whom the Watkinses had a neighborly relationship that over years became a genuine friendship. Dot Callahan came to dinner once a month and talked about everyone in Millhaven with the detailed affection of someone who had an investment in the well-being of the whole community, and expressed it through an absolute refusal to mind her own business, which they both found deeply endearing. Catherine Blake visited twice a year. She and Hazel maintained a correspondence that was, on the surface, about legal matters relevant to the ranch and the broader county, and was also about being women who had found their own ways through an era that made that harder than it needed to be. Catherine never married, by choice and not by circumstance, and she said once at their kitchen table that the ranch and the family they had made were the most sensible love story she had ever witnessed, which Hazel received as the high compliment it was. In the summer of 1882, Hazel went to the Millhaven Livestock Fair with Perry. This time they went as buyers together, which was an experience of comfortable conspiracy. They had discussed what they needed beforehand, they had a number in mind, and they moved through the fair with the practiced ease of 2 people who understood what the other was looking at without having to explain. They were at the bidding pen for a young quarter mare when a man across the pen began bidding with the quiet, economical lift of 2 fingers that Hazel had once found so alarming, and she turned to Perry and said in a low voice, "He's a fierce buyer." "He's good," Perry agreed. "Watches the leg action." "Should we be worried?" Perry looked at the chalkboard, looked at the mare, looked at their number which was comfortably above the current bid. "No," he said, "we've got room." Hazel leaned into him slightly, just the shoulder, the way you do with someone who is simply there, and watched the bidding with the calm of someone who knows what they are looking at and knows what they have and is not afraid of either. They got the mare. The man across the pen dropped out 2 bids before they reached their number, and the auctioneer's hammer came down, and it was simple and unexciting and very satisfying. On the way out of the fair, a young woman at the east fence was watching the next bid with an expression of fierce, determined concentration that Hazel recognized with a startling immediacy. Something about the set of her shoulders. Something about the way she was holding her purse and looking at the chalkboard like she was doing mathematics in her head. Hazel stopped. "Perry," he looked. "She's calculating whether she can cover the next bid," Hazel said. He looked at the woman, then at Hazel. "Probably." Hazel was quiet for a moment. Then she walked over to the young woman, who turned with a slightly startled expression at being approached. "Excuse me," Hazel said. "Are you looking at the bay gelding?" "I am," the young woman said. She was perhaps 22, with direct eyes and the look of someone who had come to this fair with a plan. "He's a solid animal," Hazel said. "Straightforward temperament. Good for working stock if that's what you need." The woman looked at her, then at the pen, then back. "Do you know horses?" "I do," Hazel said. "I run a breeding operation east of town, Winslow on the deed." Something cleared in the young woman's expression. "I've heard of Winslow horses," she said. "If you need advice on anything at the fair today, I'm happy to give it," Hazel said. "No obligation in it." Just she paused and glanced back at Perry, who was watching this with a quiet expression she understood fully. Someone once told me that knowing what you're looking at is valuable, and it doesn't cost anything to share it. The young woman smiled. It was a slightly cautious smile, the smile of someone who was accustomed to managing alone, but it reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I might take you up on that." Hazel nodded and walked back to Perry, who fell into step beside her as they headed toward the wagon. "You told her it was no obligation," he said. "It isn't," Hazel said. "You sound like someone I know," he said. She glanced up at him. He was looking straight ahead, but the corner of his mouth was doing the thing it did. She bumped her shoulder against his arm. "I learned from the best," she said. They drove home in the afternoon light with the new mare following behind, and Gerald, who was 2 now, and had developed strong opinions about the quality of his perch, sitting on the wagon seat between them with his small hands on his knees in a posture of intense satisfaction. The Kansas plains spread around them in all directions, wide and indifferent and beautiful in the way only flat country can be beautiful, which requires acceptance of a certain bigness in the world and a willingness to find your place within it rather than imposing on it. Hazel held her son's hand on the wagon seat and watched the horizon and thought about all the mornings she had gotten up alone in the house her father had left her and done what needed doing and not been able to see this far forward. She thought about the tobacco tin behind the fireplace stone. She thought about a livestock fair where she had stood at the east fence and said $140. "Perry," she said, "what would you have done if I hadn't outbid you on principle?" He considered this with his usual seriousness. "I suppose I would have bought the horse," he said. "Gone home, had a very ordinary August." He looked at her. "Been considerably worse off." "You couldn't have known that at the time," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I know it now, and now is what matters." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and he shifted the reins to his left hand and put his right arm around her, and Gerald, between them, looked up at each of his parents in the careful examining way of a small person assembling the world, and apparently found what he saw satisfactory and looked back at the road ahead. In 1883, their second child arrived, a girl they named Clara Ruth after Perry's mother. She came in a February that was harsher than most, and announced her presence in the world with a particularly fierce and concentrated energy that the midwife said she had not encountered in quite that volume before, and which Hazel told Perry was absolutely his fault. Clara grew fast and curious and fearless, and was from a very young age interested in the horses in a way that confirmed something about inheritance that Hazel found deeply moving. The homestead grew too carefully, practically, always in a way that made sense rather than a way that was impressive. Perry added a proper barn where the old deteriorating one had been, building it with the 2 Ortega brothers helping over the course of one industrious autumn. Hazel extended the kitchen garden into a proper market garden and began selling at the Millhaven market twice a month, turning a modest income that was entirely hers in the way she had always insisted her accounting be, and which she spent as she thought best and reinvested where it mattered. The Winslow Watkins operation was, by the mid-1880s, one of the most respected small ranches in the county. Not the largest, not the flashiest, but known for honesty in its transactions and quality in its stock, and a fairness in its dealing that reflected the particular character of the 2 people who ran it. People came to buy horses and left feeling they had gotten exactly what they had been told they would get, which sounds simple but was in that era, and in that business not as common as it should have been. Chet Purvis sold a portion of his operation and retreated somewhat from county life, following the legal reversal of 1878. He lived out his years in a diminished version of his former power, still cheerful in his public manner, still occupying space with the broad certainty of a man who had once believed the world arranged itself around his convenience, but no longer with any particular claim on the land east of his fence. Hazel passed him at the Millhaven market sometimes and he nodded back, and that was the extent of it. Some knots, properly loosened, require nothing more. Martin Graves retired in 1884 and was replaced by a younger lawyer who had trained under Catherine Blake and who carried a different set of assumptions about whose property rights were worth defending. Hazel found this deeply satisfying, in a way she did not feel the need to make a speech about. The summer of 1886 was the summer Gerald, now 6, fell in love with the roan stallion in the specific unguarded way that children love animals. Completely, unreservedly, spending every available hour leaning on the corral fence and talking to Copperhead in a steady murmuring conversation that Hazel watched from the kitchen window and felt so much about that she could not have ordered the feelings into any useful list. Copperhead was 12 now, still beautiful, still sound, still the animal she had made her stand over at the east fence of the Millhaven Livestock Fair on a morning 8 years before. He was slower than he had been, but his temperament manageable, the handler had called it, which had turned out to mean genuinely fine, easy, and wise in the particular way that good horses become wise, had deepened rather than diminished. Perry, coming out of the barn one evening, stopped beside Hazel at the kitchen window and looked at his son at the corral fence. "He gets it from you," Perry said. "He gets his love of that horse from me," she agreed. "He gets his absolute refusal to be told no from you." Perry smiled. "I was thinking his good sense." "I know you were," she said. "I'm providing the accurate version." He put his arm around her from behind. They stood there watching Gerald explain something to Copperhead with considerable earnestness, and Clara, who had toddled out of the house and across the yard without either of them noticing, arrived at the corral fence and grabbed it with both small hands and looked up at the horse with the same focused attention her brother wore, and Copperhead lowered his large, warm head and breathed gently in the direction of both of them. Hazel thought, "There it is. There is the thing that all of it was for, not the land, though the land mattered. Not the legal victory, though it had been necessary. Not even the marriage, though the marriage was the ground of everything. But this ordinary evening in a Kansas summer, the light going gold across the pasture, the children at the fence, the man whose arm was around her, the horse she had fought for standing patient and magnificent in the corral she had built, on the land she had saved, in the life she had refused to surrender." She put her hand over Perry's where it rested at her waist. He tightened his arm slightly, which was what he always did, the small language they had developed for "yes, I'm here, everything is good." They stood there until the light changed and the children needed to come inside, and then they gathered them up and went back into the warmth of the house, and the evening came down over the land like a hand smoothing a quilt, and everything that had been uncertain was certain now, and everything that had been taken was reclaimed, and everything that had been lost was not forgotten but carried forward into something living and real. The tobacco tin behind the fireplace stone was empty. Hazel had moved it to the mantelpiece years ago, lid open, filled now with the small things children collect and give to their parents as gifts: smooth stones, a bluebird feather, a piece of glass worn soft by creek water. It sat there in plain sight, no longer hiding anything, which seemed exactly right. And in the clear Kansas mornings, when the light came up over the eastern pasture and turned the world briefly gold, Hazel Winslow Watkins would sometimes stand on the porch with her coffee and look out at it all, the land, the corral, the garden, the smoke rising from the chimney of the house she had kept against every attempt to take it, and feel, in the very deepest and most reliable part of herself, the specific quiet of a woman who had fought for what was hers and won it, and who had found along the way something she had not known to fight for and been given it anyway. She had stood at the east fence of a livestock fair and outbid the fiercest buyer in 3 counties, on principle, with $180 and 10 of them borrowed. He had stopped bidding and introduced himself. And the rest, as it was with all real stories, had simply been life, which was the whole point and more than enough.